Let's start with the story. So somebody linked me Savage Book's Savage analysis of Attack on Titan. He focuses on macro and micro plotting, and I've never heard of it used in those terms, but hey, you know what? It was pretty cool. But I was waiting, or perhaps idiotically so, for a specific term, and it never really came. And then I thought to myself, is this term used that often? And it's kind of funny, because it kind of isn't. I mean, Jaden's video is the only one that I know of that directly tackles it, despite the overwhelming ubiquity of it.
Your subscription to Reddit Premium has expired. Click here for details on how
So, let's talk about it. Let's talk about Attack on Titan Season 1.
Bro, wait a minute. What if the reason why they don't talk about it is not because they don't know about it, but because it's so ubiquitous that there is no need to talk about it? Huh? Are you really willing to risk looking like a pompous ass just for the sake of a few views?
みんな知ってるこれジャパニーズスクールのジャパニーズクラスでこれをやったから知っている起承転結これがストーリーの作り方ストーリーメイキングの基礎だと言われるよく言われる
This is Goto Junpei. He's part of a manga scenario school named Tokyo Name Tank, and he's a mangaka. And here he's talking about kishotenketsu.
初めから最後まで全部考えるんじゃなくてまず分けて考えるといいんじゃないかなみたいな
On a basic level, it's a pretty straightforward setup. Ki for introduction, Shou for development, Ten for shift, and Kets for conclusion. In short, you give the audience information they need to understand the general premise or argument. And you expand on that information, and then you shift the vantage point. And then what you do is you reconcile that shift with what you developed in the first two sections. And once you have a basic idea of kishotenketsu, you can kind of see it everywhere. And if you're confused on what it still looks like, you can see how Yonkoma, for instance, structure their plots. The 4-panel structure is really easy to understand. You've got the setup, the repartee, twist, and boom, the punchline. And you'll find kishotenketsu directly referenced in game design. The one that everyone always talks about is Mario and its level design, because it's particularly effective at teaching requests, again within a structure with some sort of procedural rep. It's all about exploration. And the anime one-core watching format slots nicely into it as well. Sanwagiri, or the 3-episode rule, would fall into the first fourth, the introduction, giving its audiences the basic information they need to interpret the rest of the series. But some shows obviously mess around with this.
いい最終回だったって言って3話切りされることもあるんだぜ次回物質大爆発その理由は見てのお
But
楽
here's
し
the
み
thing, right? Why is this important? Like, who cares, right? Well, when we talk about storytelling, we tend to think of it as points that are in service or deferred to a later crucial point. The huge emphasis on, say, Chekhov's gun, for instance, is emblematic of that. Something functionally has to mean or be used or incorporated into something else. But oh my god. Instead of going from point A to point B as a 3-act structure would, kishotenketsu allows you to wander, and through wandering, it lets you get a grasp on the world it builds. Thus, storytelling is thought more of as a framework to be interpreted rather than a message to be expressed. And it's because of this emphasis on storytelling as framework that it's often called the plot without conflict.
Are you seriously implying that Attack on Titan
my God,
doesn't
holy
have
shit,
any
what the hell?
conflict? I mean, have you seen the show?
So, what about Attack on Titan? Attack on Titan, in particular its first season, which consists of the bulk of my textual analysis, unfortunately, fella, is an incredibly orthodox, in a good way, application of kishotenketsu to some really interesting effects. We often presume stories as an exchange. You got action, reaction, conclusion, boom, done. This is at the heart of the conflict presented, but kishotenketsu is focused less on conflict and more on dynamism.
国際的な三部構成から考えると、この起承転結の4部構成は全く論理的ではありません。
And sometimes that can be real violent.
そんなものが何の役に立つっていうの。
しかし、この日本ではこの4部構成が、非常に好まれます。
And Attack on Titan definitely uses that. Upon publication of the first manga chapter, Isayama mentioned on his blog that he felt that it probably should have been more exciting and that he probably should have offloaded a lot more of the introduction into the second chapter. This introduction he's referring to is Ki from kishotenketsu. So he is, on a basic level, aware of it and has attempted to apply it. But on a structural level, there's quite a lot going on. Alright, so let's move on to the anime and break down season 1. It's 25 episodes with the recap, so it splits up into 2 sections pretty evenly. In those two sections, you have 2 straightforward arguments. How the humans position themselves in the war against the Titans, and in the latter, what that war necessarily means. In the first section, the story introduces the conditions, what Eren wants to do, what the corps has to face, and then it launches them right into the middle of the war. But that war undergoes a dramatic twist. So, alright, Eren gets beast mode, and boom, surprise, he comes back all beast mode, and beast mode someone else. The twist here sets up the first argument presented in the macro 4-act structure. The Titans are, or at least some of them, might be human. So now we gotta reconcile with that. After the break, we reset the structure. Now that we know Eren can become a Titan, this section focuses on figuring out the limits of his abilities, right? Though it's labeled in 3 parts, the overall structure is still pretty similar. They set up what they need to do as well as Eren's role, and then they run into the female Titan. Though the female Titan consists of a significant amount of the second half, the twist is still roughly in the same place, because around episode 20, they gotta deal with a mole in the squad. And thus, the turn here isn't just that Eren isn't unique, because there's somebody else, but there is also something grander, something conspiratorial.
以前君が言っていた推論通りに巨人化を解いた後ある程度動けるタイプだとすれば
So why is this important or relevant to Attack on Titan? Like, of all the shows, why this one? I could have talked about any of them, right? Well, other than trying to harvest views, of course. One of the strengths of kishotenketsu is that it's strikingly capable at setting up spatial awareness within a narrative. By forcing the reader to reconcile the twist with what they understood as the first 2 parts, they not only come to a greater conclusion, but also have a clearer idea of the scope of what it is they were given. And this can be used in pretty striking ways. Rudy Barrett, for instance, actually uses horror as an example of effective kishotenketsu, because horror is really exceedingly good at taking advantage of the twist. The eerie part as a shift decenters the assumed viewer. Something in effect becomes off. And for horror, it's made to cause a sense of discomfort. And this is just as applicable to Attack on Titan. Attack on Titan is a particularly noteworthy example because it is all about how a shift in vantage point rejigs the fundamental conclusions people come to. That there is a realization that something is broader than immediately assumed, and the conclusions we come to demands an earnest reconciliation with what we know versus what we don't know.
巨人を殺してる。
The act of discovery and reconciliation with this shocking information is, in incredibly populous language, really the heart of Attack on Titan. It is kishotenketsu in an abstract sense. The structure here is everywhere.
これが成功すれば、この世界の真相に迫れることになる。でも、そのためだとしても。
But of course, there's an analysis in hindsight. I mean, Attack on Titan involves 4s, right? So can we just go with that for seasons or sections?
Okay, hold up.
Oh my god, Jesus Christ.
You know what? 1 second, guys.
Come on, come on. Remember watching the third episode of Madoka Magica for the first time? A lot of people mention this moment as a place where it gets real dark, where everything turns, and if the Soviet animation hadn't tipped you off, like this would have, right? But there's actually something important about that. Because one, it makes sense, but it also brings up an important question. Is this the end of the introduction? On one hand, you can look at Mami's death and go, well, of course. It gives you everything you need to know to understand the fundamental progression that's about to happen, and then it locks the tone of the show in, and now we're in for the Ura Butcher's wild ride. Hell yes, baby. Let's go. But on the other hand, you can make an argument that it's a discombobulation of what's been presented before it, that it actually messes up the information we're given, and now we have to rework the narrative thus far. In some senses, it can feel like a false introduction. This is the basic problem presented by what we call a parallax view, where the vantage point can dictate the conclusions we make about something.
What I mean by parallax is not only what it's the literal usual meaning of the term, which is you observe an object, you see a change, but that change is not really a change in the object, but just a change in how you relate to the object in your perspective of the object. I think that one should add another twist and transpose this shift, which may appear to be just a shift in your perception, into reality itself. What interests me is objects which are in themselves inconsistent.
And it's no different here. The case of Madoka Magica doesn't dismantle or discredit the value of kishotenketsu. Arguably, it sticks the twist landing pretty well.
なんとなく察しはついてたけれど、君はこの時間軸の人間じゃないね。お前の正体も企みも、私は全て知ってるわ。なるほどね。
What matters, I think, is that a breakdown, whether you're a reader or a writer, of kishotenketsu ultimately demands coming to a conclusion as to what you think the structure is trying to do. And thus the vantage point becomes a vital perspective. After all, a twist or shift in perspective only happens under the assumption that you've got the view that the story expects from you. If the Soviet animation never trips you up, or samwagiri never stops you, then what determines the structure part of the 4-act structure can vary wildly. Or perhaps it might not even exist at all. Excuse me. Where is this bastard? Come on. I'm ready. Come on, let's go. So Scott McCloud has his book. It's called Understanding Comics, where he mentions aspect-to-aspect panels being a mainstay of Japanese comics. Knowing the existence of the aspect-to-aspect paneling does not necessarily mean that every manga incorporates it, or that it even necessarily makes any particular story better. What it does do, however, is arm yourself as a reader for a better appreciation of how this particular aesthetic object, in this immediate moment, in this lens, is presented. At the same time, it also arms you with the analytical vocabulary. What? It gives you more tools for your analysis toolbox. Kishotenketsu is similar. Just because I think it's a really noticeable and used really well in Attack on Titan doesn't necessarily mean that you must go out and see it everywhere. You don't gotta do that. But I chose Attack on Titan because to me it's everywhere. It's all about the shift and structure and attempts at grappling a world larger and more dynamic than you might have thought, and how you process that information when perspectives change, sometimes violently so. And maybe you don't see it. Maybe even after understanding it, you still don't like it. And hell, I'm not saying that kishotenketsu must be used for everything. God forgive me if I recommended the monomyth or Freytag's pyramid to everything. Bro, I'd be insane. But at least knowing about it helps. It bridges potential miscommunications and misinterpretations. It helps shift, dare I say it, the vantage point. Yeah! Landed that joke. Hell yes. Whoa, hey everybody, how's it going? So you might be wondering, why did I not talk about seasons 2, 3, and 4? Well, the answer is pretty simple. I didn't want to get bogged down into making like a really long video, and I felt like if I was talking about 2, 3, and 4 in any particular meaningful length, then what I'm going to end up having to do, right, is end up having to edit like a 30, 40, 50-minute video, and I really don't want to put people through that, and realistically, I also kind of don't want to do like a... Now, I do think that the later seasons do still stick to a sort of like macro approach to kishotenketsu, but that requires... But I can't just be all like, well, but, you know, look at the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th season, boom, see, they still do it. It requires a lot more sort of sussing out and explaining exactly how they relate to these individual things, because it starts to really unravel from there. So, didn't want to do it. Didn't want to sort of approach it in that sense, because that essentially would have just made like a really, really long video, and it would have just turned into one of those other forever projects that just would have taken too long. And maybe in some ways you might look at this kind of video and think, well, okay, well, you know, I already know about kishotenketsu, and you know, that's perfectly fine. I actually had a lot of misgivings about whether I wanted to actually touch upon this particular topic, because for the longest time, I kind of assumed that everybody knew about it, but it was also really interesting because not a lot of people actually applied it as like a sort of thing to think about with regards to stories. Which is actually really funny, because there's actually a lot of stuff with regards to the Attack on Titan community. A lot of the people who are actually really following Attack on Titan really closely, they have used this kind of story structure to talk about Attack on Titan's sort of macro structure. And so in this context, I'm largely speaking about in the sense of writing YouTubers, Anitubers, all that kind of stuff. They tend to not focus too much on kishotenketsu in this sense. Once again, if you like this video, please consider giving it a like or a subscribe. I would hugely appreciate it. I try and make videos as often as I can, but you know, I'm a pretty busy individual when I'm not just shouting at people in voice chat or something. If you want to support the channel, I would hugely appreciate it. I don't have many tiers. I try and just give everything I can with regards to the few tiers we've got. But yeah, no, it's like this kind of channel would not be possible without financial support. I know I sound incredibly tacky right now, but this is a very real kind of thing. On the subject of Patreon, let's get to the Patreon question. So I do want to mention that this video is sort of the second part in a simultaneous collaboration between myself and Jaden. He runs the TheCynicClinic channel, and if you just came to this video not entirely knowing some of the context, then you might find it interesting to take a look at his video, because he touches upon some other aspects, some of them that I haven't talked about, and he also talks about in the context of your name, you know, Kimi no Nawa. So whereas I'm talking about in the context of Attack on Titan. And so in this context, I'm using the word context a lot. And so in this sense, I think it would be really valuable to sort of understand how like both kind of play off of each other in some ways. So yeah, please check it out, because we came to the decision to release these at the same time to sort of give a sort of two-punch kind of thing. Running out of words. Let's get to the Patreon questions. Okay. So Jaden asks, TheCynicClinic asks, what are the 4 heavenly kings of AniTube videos? Okay, 4 heavenly kings. Probably say the Jim Carrey x Taiga video, that's for sure. I would have to say the video where the door falls on Uzumaki-kan. Mr. Anime is planning... No, I can't do that. Eggmath asks, which flavor of chips do you prefer, ketchup or barbecue? I would prefer ketchup, but I really only kind of eat one flavor of chips, and that's all dressed chips. So the sort of ketchup versus barbecue thing is kind of like a little bit of a moot point, because I only eat like one flavor of chips. Baron von Muffinbeard III asks, what is your favorite non-academic book? Probably the books where like you got like the castle illustrations, but they're like all like cut up so you can kind of like see inside the castles. So I guess my favorite kind of non-academic book are children's books. Sith says, how does YouTube serve the Empire? Has anyone written about it? I'm not entirely sure. So I think what Sith is referring to here is Empire by Hart and Negri. And so the thing is, oh man, it's been a while since I've read Empire, so I don't want to like accidentally sort of lock myself into like making a claim that, you know, that might actually be wrong. So I'm not entirely sure, unfortunately. That's all I've got. I don't really have much more. I think it could. I think it could sort of like functionally be a kind of an apparatus of empire, but Sam Ham, what's your favorite Japanese cult and why? So I don't have a lot with regards to Japanese cults. You know, I've talked about them here and there, but I don't really like them too much. I tend to sort of like a little bit more the sort of American millenarian cults. Heaven's Gate is like always been my favorite as a sort of like topic of study. I guess maybe Kofuku no Kaguk. Parallax actually makes a really interesting video with regards to Happy Science and what they've been doing. They're a very interesting organization from a general legal perspective. They're very active legally. So I would probably say that. Najbab says, there's several points in the Tonikawa anime where it's implied that Tsukasa is Princess Kaguya. Big if true. What are your thoughts on that development? Yes, their manga is actually gearing up towards a little bit more about that. You know, it makes a lot of sense. The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter has always been this idea of sort of you have to value something because of its sort of impermanence. Because like one of the things that comes out with regards to the original Kaguya story is that she never really actually gets with any particular suitors. She develops affections for very specific ones, especially the Emperor, but she never gets with any of them. And sort of there's this idea of this recognition or this acknowledgement of the importance of understanding the transience of all this. Which actually brings up a very interesting question with regards to Tonikawa if we're talking about in the context of like marriage and like what marriage necessarily means. Because we often think of it as a sort of a permanent like imposition of a particular relationship in a sort of legal framework, right? In a potentially patriarchal framework too. But the idea here of marriages is sort of like being a play off transience might be relevant. How it is, I'm not entirely sure because I'm just running my mouth here in the middle of the night. If you want to see me fumble your questions, then please support me on Patreon so you too can watch me fuck up on camera.